We want to thank our lead sponsor Starboard for supporting this season of the SUPfm podcast. Whether you're a seasoned racer, an adventurous explorer or a beginner, Starboard has the perfect board for you. Their race boards help riders secure 29 medals at the 2023 ICF Worlds, while their touring boards offer a blend of glide and stability, ideal for long expeditions. For those looking for top-notch paddles, the Lima pre-preg models used by world champions are a game changer, and if you're just starting out, the inflatable IGO models are stable and durable, featuring welded rails to ensure longevity. Choose Starboard for unparalleled quality and performance across all levels of paddleboarding, and the link to the Starboard website is in the show notes. Welcome to another episode of the SUPfm Podcast, and on this show we chat with people from the SUP tribe or to people who can help us improve our knowledge and increase our love of both the sport and the water. Every episode is intended to inspire you or to help you to get more deeply immersed in the sport, whatever your current experience level, through my conversations with guests who include leading athletes, scientists, explorers, TED speakers and New York Times best-selling authors. If you'd like to support, please subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. And if you're already doom scrolling, then why not also take the opportunity to make sure that you're following us on Facebook, Instagram, and our new YouTube channel. This season is all about adventure and accessibility. And in this episode, I speak to Andrew Hughes. Andrew is a professional adventurer with a list of achievements that include summiting Everest, completing the 7 summits across the 7 continents, and skiing to the South Pole. But he also holds the world record for the highest altitude stand-up paddleboarding, a feat he accomplished at 19,364 feet on a peak in the Atacama Desert in Chile. In this episode, he discusses the mental and physical preparation required, emphasising the importance of teamwork, humility, and knowing your limits. So I hope you enjoy my chat with mountaineer, explorer, and record breaker Andrew Hughes. Hi, Andrew. Just to start off, it's always traditional to have a dig below the surface to explore your background and what led you into this adventure-based life. And as I was researching this episode, I realised that aside to your life in Seattle as a solid US citizen, you do also have some pretty solid ties with the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. So my great-grandfather actually served in the RAF. He was a pilot, shot down, was part of actually the guinea pigs. So one of the first group of soldiers ever to have plastic surgery done upon them for burns and other kind of wounds that occurred during the war. And then after the war, he moved actually down to Australia took the whole family down there, down to Thredbo, a little ski lodge. So I actually just formally got my dual citizenship earlier this year.
Oh, wow.
So spent a lot of time over the years going back and forth to grad school at London. Still have family scattered all over, as is the case normally with a lot of British family going off through Canada, Australia. But yeah, deeply, half of me is definitely linked to over across the pond.
So just looking back into your background, just tell us about you as a kid, because something which tends to be common amongst many of the guests who appear on this podcast is that they love spending time in nature because they did it for fun when they were growing up. And I'm guessing that's the same for you too.
Yeah, so my mom and my father ran a English-style bed and breakfast outside the city, out of the country. It's like a 26-acre, very quaint, I would say, a dialed-down farm, but it was like Noah's Ark with 2 of everything or more, but very much an opportunity for guests to come from the city, go away with no phones, no TVs, and having like some experience in nature. And for a kid, it was the ultimate playground because there was old abandoned cabins in the wood from 19th century, early 19th century logging days. There was bears wandering around and coyotes. There was big fields and places to go and play near the pond. So it was just a playground for me to run around and work on. And then, of course, we were so close as well to the waterways. The Northwest is beautiful and full. And so we were 10 minutes away from the Hood Canal and the ability to kind of go off and kayak and paddle. From a very young age, we're going up to the San Juan Islands and on small little sailboats. So it was it was very much a special experience between being on the farm and being on the water as a kid.
And if we fast forward a little bit, you clearly got a high achievement gene in there. You gained various degrees, and at one point you had a very clear focus on a career path in law, and I think you also had a run for political office, and those are two areas which individually you absolutely have to be all in for. And then that turned into a complete change in direction and priorities.
I think for a lot of us that come from families that had, I would say, a strong hand in guiding us to where we thought we were supposed to be, kind of breezed right past some of the other exits and opportunities that kind of exist in our life, maybe where the passions are pushing us, but not actually the mile markers don't say we can go down that way. And so for me, I kind of was very focused, kind of the eldest son, the only grandson, and I felt this kind of pressure that kind of came from my grandfather and my family to kind of go down one path, and built a life, as many do, based upon a lot of external markers and accolades and milestones, which all were, I'm really grateful for to have the opportunity to have done, but they all really distanced me as well from a lot of things that I was personally passionate about and wanted to really embrace and explore. And so when those things kind of fell apart, when I didn't win office, my first run, when I got a divorce, like it was basically a country song for me, kind of playing, like everything. My dog died at that time. It was a perfect time, as many do, to kind of head back to nature to heal and find yourself a little bit again.
And is there anything that you've gained? I mean, obviously your life is very different now from that very precise career path. Is there anything that you've gained from the law or your political experience that you still find useful now, or was that world, its most effective contribution to just point you in the right direction?
Yeah, I think again, it's like how I talk about failed summits. There's never a failed summit. There's just an opportunity to learn from not reaching the summit. And so any path, even professional or like personal, all these things kind of came together. I mean, you can learn from a breakup or divorce about how to be a better partner in life. You can learn from a career path that doesn't end well, or an educational path that doesn't lead you to necessarily that educational outcome. They're all toolkits and opportunities for you to extract value from. And so for me, law school was amazing. Even during the law school process, I realized I was more interested not in kind of being a transactional attorney, but more being a social advocate. And I went to a Jesuit school, so there was a lot about social justice. And I worked in policy work that kind of touched on environmentalism and kind of nuclear energy and a bunch of things like that down that way. I worked on campaigns, so touching on lots of issues. I worked with local juvenile defendants and kind of worked in schools teaching law to kind of empower at-risk kids with their own sense. And so for me, it was like, this is, how do I get involved in the community with my legal degree, not how do I kind of make a ton of money and go and be a huge class action lawyer, which there's nothing wrong with that, but that's just not where my passion and my heart was. And so, and the same with running. It was when Obama was running, and I definitely swept up those beliefs that idealism and opportunity could come together and I'd be able to kind of change the system. And in a way, I was able to push the incumbent on issues that were, for me, important at the time, and that weren't being addressed fully within kind of the conversation and discourse. So those things translate wonderfully now to being an advocate and feeling very empowered when I'm navigating maybe some of the legal issues that are surrounding the policies that are being put forth, or looking at trade issues when it comes to why certain things are being allowed to be done to these waterways, maybe in Chile. And I think there's nothing's ever wasted. My grandma always said, and I feel that's very much about the path I've been on. And I've found as much value as I can, even on the things that would be considered to be a dead end or a failure.
Absolutely. You understand the roots in, and that makes you a lot more impactful in terms of being that advocate. So that was a huge change in career and career direction, turning to adventure, both in terms of your career pathway, but also physically, because you're going from an environment where you probably sit on your backside for the majority of the day, to one where it's very much the opposite. So what were those early expeditions and that physical transition like? Because you don't go directly from that to Everest, do you?
No, and it's quite humbling as well, especially when you start climbing, as I did, more in my early 30s than my early 20s. Um, you come in with a bit of more of an ego and a lack of understanding, which is a very dangerous and deadly thing sometimes. And so I first climbed locally here in the Northwest on Mount Rainier. I couldn't find anybody who wanted to do it with me, probably because most of them had not gone through a divorce and had not started over their lives and had family and kids and couldn't just justify to their wives or partners to go off and climb a mountain. But for me, I loved this kind of redefining of discomfort. And it was something that made me feel challenged. And there was like this unification between my physical, mental, and emotional that had to come together to make it happen. And so I kind of went all in, but I definitely did not take training as seriously as I think I should have. And so like the very first mountain that I climbed, like a big mountain, Aconcagua, I started off and I showed up and I saw the people around me that were on my team because I just signed up with a local guiding company and they were much older than me and I thought they were slower than me. And it was just one of those things early on where your hubris thinks it's going to carry you to great heights. And you realize very quickly how humbling altitude can be and also how respectful you need to be of the process and the preparation. So the first big climb I ever did, I didn't even get beyond really base camp. I did the trek in and then I did one climb up and had just a horrible form of either AMS or HAPE or something that was undiagnosed. They were all speaking Spanish when they put me in a helicopter and sent me off the mountain. And so from early on, I wasn't even sure whether this was a path that my body was going to allow me to do. I luckily am stubborn enough to go back and train harder and change my tactics and try to learn from that process, and came back and have had much better success, but it's because I have a much different approach. But the physical aspect is huge. And I think it's one of those things that is the hardest part because most of it's done alone and in isolation. I mean, a lot of the work that people see never gets, it's the culmination of everything that's happened for months and months and months. And so people always ask, like, how do you climb Everest? So it's years ago you started that climb. And like, I think any big dream or anything else, there's just so much that's done out of sight, and people celebrate the summit moments, but there's so many moments that are more meaningful and more impactful and more important that precede that.
Absolutely. It's all about enjoying the process, isn't it? And that for adventure, there are so many common threads. Although the majority of your adventurous life has been at high altitude, there's just so much to learn about adventure in general, and particularly what you said about hubris and going into it with a I know it all type mindset, and I can teach these guys a thing or two. It doesn't tend to end happily, does it, in those circumstances?
No. I think it's one of the, I think there's the people that I see have the most trouble are the ones that don't have the humility to like listen to their bodies, listen to their teammates, and who push themselves into a place of danger. It's one of I think the most tragic thing about so many deaths in the mountains, especially high altitude places, is it's usually not because the life couldn't have been saved. It's because somebody wanted to like chase a dream in their life. Into a place that just, it wasn't the time for it. And they pushed it too hard. I mean, this is what happens sometimes in bankruptcies or people who's failing businesses or marriages. It's just, you have to kind of read the environment around you and you have to like understand where you are in that moment. Not where you were the day before, not where you're going to be maybe in a couple of days, but like, where are you right now? And I was told early on, it's not about whether you can get to the summit from where you are. It's about whether you can get back to where you need to be.
Exactly.
And so like every step is a determination of, can I complete the full climb, which isn't the summit, it's the ascent and the descent. So
yeah, I mean, that's fascinating stuff. And you see it all over the place. And at the start of this last season, I chatted to a guy called Lawrence Gonzalez, who deals with these human factors in safety and the fact that people really disregard them. And I do want to go into all of that stuff in a bit more detail in a second. But just to sort of focus out on your achievements, you're clearly a man who likes a list. You've completed the 7 summits, which is the highest point on the 7 continents, which obviously included Everest, the Antarctic trifecta, and the 7 highest volcanic peaks. Could you just explain those last 2 challenges? Because I don't think they're quite as well known, but they're every bit as meaty as the 7 summits.
Yeah, I mean, I think this may be an echo from probably my mom, but then my lawyer days of list making and enjoying a good thing I can tick off as well, just creating some sort of structure to go after. But the Antarctica trifecta is essentially the ability to reach the South Pole by your own kind of volition, your own physical means, to climb the highest mountain, which is Vincent Massif, and then to climb Mount Sidley, which is the highest volcano on the continent of Antarctica, and to do all in a single season, ideally, which had only been done by one other person beforehand. It's the challenge is not necessarily the altitude and situation, but just the logistical and the weather elements that are quite demanding of being in Antarctica. Mount Sidley also is extremely remote. I think we were the 50th and 52nd person to ever climb it. There's 5 of us on our team, so at the time, it had been less than 50 people that had ever climbed the mountain before, landing on a place that no one's ever landed to climb it. So we were fortunate. There's many times we thought we weren't going to be able to complete it because we got pushed back from the summit one time. We got stuck at high camp for over a week with barely any food. On Vincent Massif. And so there was lots of things that kind of didn't quite line up. But in the end, we just squeaked it together. We were able to do it in, I think, just over 40 days door to door, which was a new record. And the first time for any American. And then the 7 summits for the volcanics are there's the 7 highest volcanoes on each continent as well. Much like the second 7, they're usually a little more meaty sometimes, depending upon the continent. So and usually a little more remote as well. Volcanoes also are just, I think, in my opinion, sometimes a bit more challenging to climb based upon their terrain. Or just a little less fun. They're usually scree and a lot of things that kind of have you sliding backwards as you're trying to move upwards.
So I am going to chat about some of those things a little bit later, but you've had a huge number of adventures, and I do want to cover what we can learn from them. But first, I wanted to pick out some of those paddleboarding adventures. And as I mentioned, you hold the world record for paddleboarding at high altitude. How did you first encounter paddleboarding, and what gave you the idea of combining that with high altitude?
Yeah, so paddle sports, since I was a kid, I've been on the water. Long before I was climbing any mountains, I was on the water. Kayaking, 42 now. Paddleboarding was not a huge thing when I was growing up. But moving over to Seattle, I'm basically a stone's throw away from Lake Washington and Lake Union, which are just full of paddleboards in the summertime. And so about a handful of years ago, just before the pandemic came down, I had my first chance to go on a big, huge, massive paddleboard with some friends. And I was like, this is just lovely to be on the lake, on the water. And kind of over the years, it kind of integrated it in whenever I could do it. And then when the pandemic happened, I started thinking about ways I could go back to places that I loved and things I missed, and ways to maybe marry together parts of my life and different passions I had that necessarily weren't always just chasing summits, but could go back and re-experience and expand my experience. And I think deepen my connection to the places that I was racing to sometimes just to get up and get off, instead of kind of being there, and just change the approach and the experience. And so I was able to kind of get paddleboarding, getting the paddleboard record approved to attempt. And then it took about 3 years before the world lined up and everything lined up that I could actually head to Chile to attempt. And even then, the situation almost was impossible based upon some of the climate issues that we found once we were there.
And you took an inflatable up there on your back as well, didn't you? Which is not an ideal load for vertical distances.
No.
And then probably the thing that people will also make the connection with is that you pumped it up by hand, which is something lots of recreational paddlers complain about having to do. I mean, I guess you'd had a pretty solid base of cardio when you got up there, but at 19,000 feet, it's not the same as pumping it up at sea level. No,
it was as challenging maybe at times as carrying it up there. It's just the packs are, I think, evolving a lot, and I've given a lot of feedback loop to the people that I've worked with over the last couple of years doing some of these carries. I think a lot of the packs in the past that were promoted as kind of carrying your board to the water were not meant to be climbing vertical ascents of huge volcanoes. Based upon the weight distribution and the structure of the pack, I think that's definitely going to evolve. I think hopefully, maybe through kind of the feedback loop that I'm giving to some of these people or sharing kind of the pains. But it was it might have been a harder carry than some of the mountains I've ever climbed, just to kind of get that up there. The paddling itself was lovely and wonderful once we were on the water, but it was, I was coming off COVID as well, that I realized once I got home. I didn't know I had COVID at the time. And the airline had lost my bags and all my meds and my sleeping bag for the first week. And so like, it was a challenge of a climb, and a record. But at the end of the day, I mean, that only makes it sweeter. But at the very end, like, we were able to like make it happen on the very last day possible.
And part of adventure is being adaptable and flexible, because you never really know, what challenge is going to be heading in your direction. So as long as you've got a plan or at least an alternative, I guess that's a skill which helps you in whatever adventure you're at.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that like you can't hold too tightly to a plan. It's just one of those things. There's like some like beautiful conversations and philosophies about like trying to hold water in your hand and just you gotta let it run like through your fingers, and just as that's like a plan. Just like you can't hold it, you have to just let it flow. And that's kind of when you're in the mountains and you're dealing with so many things out of your control. You mitigate what you can through proper planning, and then you do the rest through proper patience and like trying to keep the proper perspective.
And I'm very fond of a saying from the famous philosopher Mike Tyson, who said, everyone's got a plan until you get punched in the face.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, and once you get punched,
wise words.
Absolutely.
So how are the weather conditions up there? Obviously, they're warm enough for the water to be liquid, but they looked pretty blowy as you made your way up there, but sheltered at water level.
Yeah. So like the conditions itself, I mean, we had the Atacama itself is pretty windy. It rips around pretty heavy up there. And so that was definitely an issue for us. The Guinness World Record also, for some reason, mandates you have to be on your knees or laying down. I don't even know if the laying down would work necessarily to paddle. But it was probably best with what we were having, because the crater itself just was creating this crazy circular wind that was just ripping in all directions. And I mean, it was challenging to navigate within it. It just, I don't even think the videos do it justice for like how much it was just ripping through there. At the very end, basically like it lifted the paddleboard and almost took it out of the crater. It was pretty rough, and it's very dusty up there, and there's just a lot of stuff going on, and the heat's pretty gnarly as well. But yeah, I think the main issue up there is that they just haven't had the same amount of precipitation for so many years. And so when we walked up there, all the satellite, no one really climbed this mountain because it's not a trophy climb, which again is why I kind of love these records, going after these paddling records, because they're usually taking you to peaks and places that most people just discount because they are not the highest, or they're like don't have the most technical necessarily kind of profile. But for me, there's these beautiful like pools that just sit there and just call to me. And so like going up there, we were, I think, maybe the first people that climbed it that entire season, and maybe the only ones that would. And so all the other data that we had collected and recon we had done had been through satellite imagery, and the waters were just about 13 meters higher than they actually were from the latest satellite imagery. And so that kind of like, that actually connected to a lot of other changes in glacial regression and snowpack and water levels I'd seen throughout my entire 2 weeks returning to the Atacama, where I'd been to 7 years before. And it was just kind of, that was really the launching pad for everything else that I'm kind of going after now.
And you can very clearly see from the video that the glacier has retreated there. Yeah. And this wasn't just about the world record, but as you say, to provide measurements with climate change and the effects on biodiversity and other things.
Yeah.
And I guess that applies across all areas that you've gone to, really, because you've got isolated communities living in those areas who are very reliant on the water and the wildlife. And I know that you've got an Arctic exploration on your agenda as well. climate change is having a real effect in all areas, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, you see it, especially this is one of the things when you go back to the same place twice, you see the dramatic shifts in kind of what was and kind of what now has kind of like become the situation in a lot of these places. And so, I mean, like going back to Nepal, I'm heading there again in about 3.5 weeks. Every time I've gone back, I've seen shifts in kind of the seasonal weather kind of windows, even between 2019 and 2021, climbing there, seeing how the weather has shifted and kind of where the weather windows are moving kind of in the season. And you also just kind of like see it in the news. And I've climbed in Alaska quite a bit and lived up there, and you see there and in Nepal, these major glacial lakes that from glacial melt now kind of blowing out and taking out entire communities. And these are all part of those things of you looking at keeping an eye on these high altitude lakes and these high altitude water formations that are taking place, because, I mean, just because they're above and usually out of sight doesn't mean they're not deeply interconnected into a greater kind of narrative and a greater equation as to what is happening with climate change and human impact, and ensuring that, I mean, in a way, they're like the canaries in the coal mine. They're sitting up, perched up on these peaks. And so the ability to go up there, and lots of people are doing a lot of research on the lakes, but most of it, because of the challenge of reaching them, isn't being done. And I'm starting to realize that most of the places that I'm planning on going to or that I've been to at this altitude are the first time anyone's ever gone to them and measured them. And you kind of need baseline measurements and baseline profiles in order to kind of better understand where they're going from. Otherwise, it's just guessing. Again, you're doing satellite imagery, which isn't exact, and giving you like a real reading as to kind of like what's happening to them on basically every year. You can go back and check it again. So.
Yeah. And I'd like to talk to you about Everest and your experiences there. But I was reading a Vice article which basically was headlined "Mount Everest is a poo-covered death trap," which wasn't the most alluring title to it. But again, it has that sort of environmental element, which is the snow at the top of Everest is retreating and uncovering a whole load of nasty things, which can have an impact on people wanting to climb it. As a bit of an Everest nerd myself, you know, that also affects other areas that you encounter if you're climbing the Khumbu icefall and so on. So it's a danger that manifests in all areas.
No, absolutely. I think like it's one of those things that you go to camp for, and you see what happens when people are in a state of extreme stress, like physical and mental stress to do something, and how quickly they abandon what they know they should be doing, which is leaving no trace and carrying out their garbage and caring for the place that they are trying to create something deeply meaningful for themselves. And I think there's also just a greater understanding now in the last decade or so that just because you throw something down a crevasse or because you leave it on a mountain doesn't mean it stays there. Denali, for instance, several years ago when we climbed it, the Parks Department still was basically flagging crevasses where you could basically put your human waste, thinking that it wouldn't eventually reach the lower waterways. But they were smart enough also to tag them with some geolocation devices, and they started realizing very quickly over the last handful of years how suddenly those things actually become a part of the greater downstream kind of environments. And they've now changed that where you pack everything out. So, I mean, I think with Everest, you see very clearly that people get into these stress positions and places in their bodies where they kind of start foregoing the things that are important, which is protecting and preserving the very environment that they're trying to create their own meaningful memories within. And I think we forget how much our impacts as we adventure have greater impacts that resonate and echo throughout the environments around us. And there is no way that we can go into any environment as adventurers, be it paddling or climbing, where we don't alter and impact those environments. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is how can we personally mitigate those impacts, and how can we be more sustainable through our endeavors? Because it's not about stopping going to climb Everest or stopping to go off and paddle somewhere on some pristine waters. It's how can I do my best to ensure that I'm protecting this or advocating for this, or in the choices I'm making in advance and while I'm there, doing as little damage as possible to the greater environmental ecosystems.
We're all about innovation with our collaboration partners, and we'd like to thank Oscar Propulsion for their support for this episode. Tested and proven, their innovative SUP paddle slits dramatically enhance paddling efficiency. This isn't a fad. Research shows a more efficient use of power input from the paddler and a significant reduction in stress on the body. To paddle brands, now's your chance to license this game-changing tech, and to our paddle community, say goodbye to paddle flutter and get ready for smoother and longer rides. Discover more, elevate your paddling experience, and join the revolution at oscarpropulsion.com/sport. Since 1979, Palm Equipment have been the go-to brand for paddle sports enthusiasts across the globe. Founded by paddlers for paddlers, Palm creates innovative, high-quality gear from head to toe and specialising in apparel and PFDs. Known as the first to produce women's-specific paddle products, including the new Tika Women's PFD, Palm ensures every adventurer is equipped for safety and style. With a commitment to sustainability and community, Palm's mission is to ensure everyone enjoys a lifetime on the water. Discover their range at specialty shops worldwide and make your paddle sport experience safer and more enjoyable with Palm Equipment. Visit palm.equipment or see the link in the show notes to gear up today. I thought we might do a bit of a deep dive into Everest. And as I mentioned, you successfully summited Everest in 21 after attempting it first in 2019. Could you just tell us about that first attempt and how it ended, and then what you changed for your second attempt?
Yeah, absolutely. So 2019 was actually a great year until it wasn't. The season was pretty much it was the last season before the pandemic, and so it was business as usual. Lovely trek in. Weather was a bit less accommodating than it had been in previous seasons, and I think that is one of the reasons that year was so deadly on the mountain. It's the year that famous photo from the summit ridge was pasted on every single the New York Times and everywhere else, of just that chalk block line of climbers just sitting there. And I think there was like 13 or 14 deaths that season, something in the top 5, I think, when it comes to losses, which is tragic. And a lot of it was because the weather had shifted to a point where there was only maybe like 2 or 3 weather days where you could feasibly do it. And unfortunately, a lot of the commentary about the fact that, people should take a ticket and that's your day and that's where you go. And that's just not how it works up there. Like, everyone has put in the time and the energy and made the investment to have an opportunity. The problem is that with the weather being what it is, it created an accordion effect where everybody kind of like was getting blocked up into like little pockets of huge pools of climbers. And so when that window opened, you had too many climbers trying to shoot through too small a hole of a window in a day. And going back to what I talked about earlier, a lot of people that had been waiting there and wanting that, and it's a huge investment for a lot of people, and it's a one-time investment for a lot of people, and people are willing to push themselves sometimes through things, or they don't communicate to their team about where they are, and that's where a lot of the losses happened that year. And for me, it was almost a blessing in disguise, but during our drop back, I caught bacterial pneumonia unknowingly in one of the tea houses. And when I climbed up to Camp 2 and was waiting there with everybody else for that weather window to open up, I felt great until the day before we were supposed to leave. And I woke up just hacking up my lungs. And this is where like the failed summits served me so well, because I knew something was wrong physically. I knew that as much as I was only like maybe like 2.5 days away from the summit, and I'd been there the whole season and then had suffered through everything else, that if I pushed myself up, there's a chance that I wouldn't come down. And so I just knew, and I took a very short walk because I could barely move. My oxygen levels were dropping so quickly at that time. But I just went and sat down near our camp and just kind of looked up at the mountain, and I realized like that was my summit. That's as far as I was going to go this year. And 2 days later, I still wasn't improving at Camp 2, and my oxygen levels were about 50 off O's. And so I was able to get in a helicopter and fly to Kathmandu, where I had to stay in the hospital for multiple days. And one of my lungs, after the x-rays were taken, which is solid white, which is covered in pneumonia. And so I always say that's my summit photo. And I have a goal, if my wife will let me, one day to kind of like put that photo next to the photo on the summit. Because I think both of them are extremely important, because like one may be celebrated, but the other one is why I'm still there to be like to have that celebratory moment. So I think those are equally important to me. But that season was pretty rough. And I think anybody who has done something like that and had to step away on their own accord will tell you it's an emotionally, it's mentally hard then, but then it's emotionally hard afterwards, because I remember laying in my tent, drugged up, and hearing on the radio squawking over tent, both the tragedies taking place, but also hearing my teammates reach the summit and call back down to Camp 2 saying they'd reached the summit, and you're sitting there kind of just trying to survive and stay alive. And you realize this dichotomy between kind of a dream and the reality that you're living. And you celebrate those that were able to realize it, and you kind of find your path forward for yourself to kind of see if you can find your own path to that dream. So, and that's another thing is I always like to return to the fact that like the mountain never provides the same climb for any two people. And so at the end of the day, we always have to climb our own mountain. And sometimes that means climbing it twice or more. I know people that have tried peaks multiple times, some of the best. And it's because they're willing to walk away that they were able to find like long-term and be old mountaineers, which is always I think a celebrated thing, or should be.
Yeah, absolutely. And then of course you succeeded in 2021. I just, because I'm particularly interested in that photo, which looks like an absolute horror show in 2019 with everyone queued up. And that happens at the Hillary Step, doesn't it? There's a single ladder, isn't there? Or a couple of ladders that go up, and that's the pinch point there. How was that different in 21 from that horrible photo in 2019? Yeah,
so it's not much different, to be honest. I mean, when we went up there, again, we also had horrible weather in 2021. There was multiple different, I think there were like cyclones coming out of the Bay of Bengal that basically converged. So we had these crazy winds and storms. And there's literally one day where you could climb during the weather window. Some people got in really early and were really fortunate. And it's usually private climbers that can do that, because anytime you're on a rope team or with a team, you're climbing usually for the slowest person, and you're climbing with, and to be fair, like I'm a slow climber, but like you're always like climbing within your team usually. And so a lot of teams, to give themselves the best chance, will do 3 rotations. The private teams will go for usually 2 rotations to acclimate themselves on these big 8,000 meter peaks, which give them opportunity to actually usually hit an earlier weather window, which are safer and usually less congested. And so there were some early summits, but then the weather turned and everyone got stuck again for right around May 23rd. And I had friends that literally we passed on the way off the summit on May 24th. They arrived and they had to turn around and come back down, because once you get to Camp 4, you have essentially at most maybe 48 hours for with your O's you have back there. And if you don't get the weather, then you have to leave. And there's other people, because it was pandemic still, that showed up at Camp 4 at that time as well. And their whole teams, all their Sherpa and support and guides that are completely the most important part for them to have some success, all came down with COVID. And so they gave everyone their oxygen and turned right back around. And so it's all these things where like you just, you just have to kind of like deal with the situation as it comes. But our day was no different. It was hard because no one had been up there in 2020. And I knew some of the people that had passed in 2019 and they were still there on the ropes. And the Hillary Step is more or less gone now after the earthquake. It's kind of shifted it into more of a slope. There's not that same kind of vertical, like kind of ascent, but there is still very much a single lane of traffic. And to get around people, you are very much clipping around and very relying upon everyone knowing how to do that. And unfortunately, you have a lot of people up there who, again, have pushed themselves to the summit and run the wheels off. And so they may be good going up, but when they're coming back down and passing you, they look like drunk and they're staggering around. And a lot of them, we decided, me and a few other people, we were just going to like basically dig ourselves into the side of the mountain a little bit and just wait. And so we just waited for everyone to basically leave, and we helped people clip around us. And we were lucky because the weather was nice. We were able to sit there just on the summit ridge of Everest for 45 minutes and just hang out, and just help people kind of go around us safely and get down the mountain. And then we got the summit basically to ourselves. There's like 5 of us up there, and it was just lovely. And we got this beautiful. And then the next day, the weather turned and it was horrific again. Yeah, it was beautiful. And then I got to propose to my wife up there.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I mean, you had to be very focused because you had a very important action to complete, and isn't that another world record as well?
Yeah, it's unofficial, but yeah, I mean, so we started dating in 2000, like end of 2018, but our first 6 months of dating, she dealt with me going to Everest and almost dying on the mountain. And so very much didn't break up with me and stayed with me. And I'm a very firm believer that like we never reach any summit alone, and we never stand upon any kind of summit achievement like by ourselves. They're always a compilation of the support and love and things around us that allowed us to reach those moments. And so I wanted her to know that when I reached this dream of myself, it was a dream that she helped elevate me to. And I thought there was no better place to propose to her, even though she wasn't there and didn't know I proposed until about a month later, back in Seattle, because she's much more of a sea level lover and a liquid water, not an icy snow water person. So, but yeah, it was a special thing, and it definitely, it made the mountain. It's what I remember more is that than the actual like, getting up there is the proposal. So.
Yeah, and it's getting down, isn't it? That's the key thing there. But you did also set another world record, didn't you, for the world's highest tea party, which is very British.
Yeah.
Obviously, you've got those connections in there. That must have required a bit of logistics as well.
Yeah, it was one of those things again that when the pandemic, because I got back from Antarctica, I had bags packed, I was ready to go to Everest. And then like everybody else, like whatever you had planned, the world stopped, and the bags basically stayed by the door for several months, just sitting there and kind of in that isolation and that moment when things kind of like stopped happening as they were with my expeditions. I started thinking about if I was given the chance to go back one day, then how would I want to evolve my experience there? And I realized I wanted to like slow down and create more of a connective experience. And so I spent the next year basically thinking of unique, sometimes as a tea party, a more of a social experience that would bring some levity. But I wanted to find ways I could give back. And so I partnered with like this company named Mir, who's based out of here in Seattle, that has like phenomenal thermoses and drinkware and a bunch of other kind of like brand partners that were supportive that all gave thousands of dollars of kit that we were able to use for the record, but then donate locally to the local Nepalese that were helping us to make all this happen. And definitely things that they can necessarily get easily up in the Khumbu. And so the record was great. And it was, I thought, a nice marriage between who I am, being raised on a lot of tea, and just the fact that tea culturally in Nepal is very much something that we kind of like come to the tea houses and share. And there's many hours with that. And it was this idea that we all had things taken from us. And this was a way that we could take back a moment that was special and share something with people that had all come from different walks of life, from different places, and come together to celebrate something more than a summit, because that's never guaranteed, but a record, like a recorded moment. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Very culturally appropriate as well. I mean, the British Royal Marines talk about cheerfulness in adversity. That's one of their values. And I guess that also helped lift morale. It wasn't something that anyone was probably expecting on the whatever camp it was on Everest.
Yeah, we did a camp 2, full summit suits on. We actually held 2 records. The first one we held was at base camp. It was 100 feet below where we needed to be, but we basically brought our entire support team, all the local porters and cooks and our local Nepalese guides, and we basically held a huge tea party for them with all the good stuff. Made a good one at base camp all together, and then over the course of rotations, I slowly packed up like little pieces of everything else to get enough for a record-setting one up at Camp 2, and it was huge, fluffy snowflakes coming down, and we just kind of like sat our camp about 21,500 feet, and did what I learned when I was back at the bed and breakfast about how to serve a proper tea, and got it all properly set up for everybody with cookies from the Girl Scouts I've carried over all the way, and little truffles and other tea cookies, and we had it out in our summit suits, and it was lovely. But you're absolutely right. I think perspective in the peaks and finding ways to like have these positive moments is everything. Like I'm a big believer of like, you have to bring joy sometimes with you and pack it in. Like when things get really rough, you can find those little joyous moments, and it might be in a little treat, it might be in a song, it might be in a book. It's whatever brings you joy that lets you kind of push back sometimes against the current of hardship and challenge that is around you.
And the reason why it's so important is it applies that release, because you don't want to be serious all the time. You don't want to be stressed all the time. It's a really important part of the process.
Yeah, I think people sometimes, and you see it all the time, you get that kind of hyper focus on all the things you can't control, the weather or the fact that we're delayed, the timing schedules moving around. And I think they just take you back to your place where you're grounded in something that is disconnected from things you can't control. So and you can go back to it in more positive places. It's very much why like you climb mountains more with your mind than your body. I've watched too many people like not be able to find success because they mentally weren't ready for all the things that they faced. They were physically probably in better shape than I was. They're like Ironman or like, professional athletes, but like you kind of see them come in with the wrong mentality, and that kind of that's their weakness. Like they didn't train that part of themselves, or they weren't prepared for not having control over their environment. Because I think a lot of people that climb big things or do a lot of adventure stuff they have a little dash of type A tucked in there, and they are very used to having control over all the elements and aspects of their training and life and everything else. And once you go out there and you're out in the wild, that's kind of, you gotta let go. So,
and again, we see it paddleboarding, particularly since the pandemic, when so many new people have joined the sport, and there's some crucial judgments to be made about weathers and say tides. Particularly if it's your last day on holiday, or you've got an expedition planned with tight time frames, or with financial commitments. I know it costs about £50,000 to even get signed up with one of these expedition companies in Everest. So there's a huge commitment there. And obviously it's known by summit fever. You've mentioned about training yourself mentally and emotionally, and that really is an advantage to you. So what is it about your training? I mean, how do you train the right mental and emotional approach to face off some of those pressures?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I was given a nice guiding kind of philosophy on one of the earliest mountains I climbed down in South America from this old guy that had 30 plus years as like a ranger and a rescuer. And he's like, we had some really big, strong, athletic individuals on that team that even as we ascended, we're still trying to train and still trying to like do push-ups and run up the local hills and do all these kind of like physical endeavors. And he like took everybody aside and he said, listen, like you can do what you want to do. I'm not telling you can't do this, but like what you showed up with on that first day of this ascent is the body that you have. And at this point in time, the mountain is going to take from you like a bank taking withdrawals, and it's going to keep on taking withdrawals from you every day. And it's up to you how you want to spend it. But you have the choice to kind of like save as much as you can for where you really need to invest that. And he's like, the one thing you can train on a daily basis is your mind. And like, because that's the one thing that no matter what is happening to your body, in fact, as your body begins to go through more, that is the fertile ground for which you can actually foster stronger mental fortitude. And I think that like basically resonated with me. And I realized that every climb I went on was this moving meditation and this training session for me, not in like becoming physically stronger, because usually you come off Everest, like I dropped 25 pounds on Everest, but I was mentally stronger. And the first, when I came up with 19 with pneumonia, like that also like was a way for me to kind of like mentally strong. In fact, like that might have been one of the heaviest mental lifts I ever had to do, was to start again and come back. And so it's one of those things where I think like the only way you can really develop mental strength is by pushing yourself physically and into places of discomfort mentally. And there's lots of ways to do it, but I think it's not one thing. You can read about it. You can go off and read Stoicism. You can but I think the best way to do it is literally to seek out discomfort, because we live in a society that is all about making life easier, which is great. I mean, I love food delivered to my door and be able to call a ride like without standing in the rain. And, it's feeling not lost because I have like a million ways to like find where I am. But there's something to be said when you kind of get lost in this world a little bit and you start finding parts of yourself through the challenge.
So just on that subject about discomfort, where would you say that to date that you've suffered the most discomfort? Because I guess sleeping in the death zone isn't ideal, but and Antarctica also has a special reputation for discomfort. So where would you say that you needed your mental strength most?
Yeah, I think Antarctica definitely pushed it, especially on the South Pole. I had a faulty harness that over the days, it kind of created like this micro whiplashes. And so by the last day, I couldn't move my entire neck or upper body. And it was just like, the level of pain was so badly that I actually just ended up once we saw, cause you see nothing for days, there's just nothing out there. And like, eventually you see the small dot, which is kind of the South Pole just sitting out there, the little research station. And yet it's like a mirage, because the closer you feel like you get, it still feels like it's forever away. And I remember getting so close to it, and then my body just started convulsing at the top from like this pain. And you're pulling a heavy sled, and you're with your team, and you don't want to let your team down. You don't want to slow them down. But I literally just like had to lay down and ask people to take the weight from me. And it's one of those moments where it's so humbling, because this is the very start. We still had to climb 2 mountains, and you're there saying like, I'm here to do this big project, and yet the very first leg you feel handicapped by the pain that's hurting you on this level. And like, it's one of those things where you have to like go through the mental willingness to say I need help, and then still suffer through the pain of still pulling your sled with a slightly reduced weight there. And like, that was very challenging, and I had like frostbite on my finger. And I think like once something starts going on, once my neck started going, and my upper body started seizing up, like that stopped me from managing the rest of my body properly. I think like you become hyper focused on one injury, and other injuries come in the back door because you stop guarding against them. And so I ended up with frostbite. I ended up with like a small little dose of pneumonia when I was, or not pneumonia, hypothermia. Like they had to like bring water bottles in one day because I was like managing my systems right, and I came in like super sweaty and wet versus managing my layers. And so I got this horrible, like my body's just started again going through another state. But it was one thing opened up. And so I honestly think the South Pole is the hardest thing I've ever done. It was my first polar traverse, and I was like, man, mountain climbing is way easier compared to this. And so I think like that one for me weirdly was the hardest. And it was just because it was its culmination of like basically a snowball effect of things. Just like just picking me up and slamming me down day. And I mean, it was beautiful and wonderful, but it was, I think, mentally one of the hardest things. And you put on top of that too, like when you're climbing, you know, you're going up, you know, you can see where the mountaintop is more or less, or where you're trying to head to. When you're doing something like the South Pole in particular, there's nothing in every direction. And you talk about ping pong balls sometimes being in a weather storm, but like, it doesn't matter whether there's a storm or not. Out there, it's just all ping pong ball. It's just like a horizon. And when the light goes down, you feel like you're not going anywhere for hours, several hours, 10 hours. And then you stop and make tent again or make camp again. And it's just, for me, it was a very hard mental shift from climbing for so long.
Yeah, and then it's the line between self-care as well, because you have this sort of no pain, no gain type attitude that some people, generally people who don't do particularly well on adventure, have. But as you say, it's about being really aware of what's happening with your body and making sure that you try and mitigate that as early as possible, so you don't end up causing yourself some sort of catastrophic injury. I don't know how you would rehab that sort of neck thing at the South Pole. I mean, I guess an ice bath might be the only thing available to you, but I'm sure you wouldn't go for that.
I mean, I think at the end of it, it was a nice little bit of meditation, kind of like we only had a 24-hour turnaround between the South Pole and started climbing Bits and Massif, and so it was one of those things where I had 24 hours to really rest it and put some medication on it, and that was about it. So eventually it kind of gave way, but I mean, you just find ways to deal with pain. Like I always think, like, it's another one of those things as well. Like, people apologize sometimes when they're having a bad day, and they start getting down on themselves. And everyone has a bad day or a crappy day on an expedition, and so I think, again, knowing that you're not alone, that somebody else is probably having another one on another day, it's just how it works. And like, that's why you're there as a team, to kind of help elevate people when they're having that day. And why do you have the humility to express when you're having one? Because you do a disservice to your team and yourself if you're unwilling to have the humility to express that you need help that day. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the subject of team, I know that all of these achievements have been assisted by others. You know, you mentioned your wife and family and friends and sponsors and others, but you've got a climbing partner, haven't you, Roxanne Vogel, who you've worked with on a number of these adventures, and she's really been ripping the rule book up in some of her preparation and her approach to some of these adventures. Just wondered if you could say a word about what she's brought to the party.
Yeah, we met on a Cascade climbing kind of trip up here in the Northwest early on. We both kind of were just really at the start of our kind of 7 Summits journey together, or not together, just on our own individual ones. And we lived in different states, but just, you know, we were both kind of very much alone in our local communities, in the sense of friends that would actually be able to keep us accountable. And so we just kind of like made this commitment that we would try to, like, you know, keep in touch and keep climbing together. And she definitely, I would say, is far more athletic than me on all levels. Like, she is a phenomenal athlete. I think I am, it's like the tortoise and the hare kind of. She's speed and I'm slow. But it kind of paired out because our approach is balanced. So I could pull her back when she was maybe pushing too hard into something, and she could like motivate me when I needed to like speed up and get after like a summit window or something like that. So but yeah, I mean, we were both climbing Everest in 2019. Is when she completed her 7 summits. And she did a phenomenal, I don't think it's been repeated since, but I think it was 14 days or just under 14 days door to door for Everest on the north side. So I climbed on the south side. She was on the north side, and she did slept in the tents back home, got herself pre-acclimated, trained to a phenomenal level. And then with Lydia Bradley was able to kind of get to the mountain and just basically just go up, come down, and get back home to San Francisco in 2 weeks, which is unreal. I think it's still a record right now. So yeah, I mean, she's an amazing athlete, and there's no way that the marks that I like reached would have been possible without her support and kind of her friendship over the years.
And that achievement, and we probably should have explained this a bit earlier, that the whole thing around Everest is about acclimatization to the altitude, isn't it? Which is why you do your rotations, because you go up to various camps and then you come down, and it's all about getting your body able to deal with all of those sort of pressures further up. So she slept, I think, or spent a lot of time in a hypoxic tent, which sort of recreates those altitude conditions, and that was the challenge, because usually you'd be there for a month or 6 weeks or possibly even longer, but she did the whole thing up and back in that amount of time.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. I mean, it's just purely it takes so long for your body to properly acclimate, even using oxygen. And so, I mean, the trek up to base camp, that's part of our acclimation process of 11 days. The 3 rotations, which is basically standard for most operations, is just simply to get you at a place where you have the greatest opportunity for success. And what she was able to do, and I think environmentally, she just had such a great opportunity, because she works for GU Energy, the little food supplement company, and they were able to actually create, even in their offices for her, right down in San Francisco, a fully kind of hypoxic office, so she could literally work and train during the day. So in that environment, which I think is so challenging, I mean, so beneficial, because so many few people can actually have that at their office or in their workplace. And she was able to have that kind of again, back to the support. She was able to have the support of all the the most important stakeholders in her life to help her kind of pull that together. But then you still have to do it. And it's not fun. Those tents are not fun. People, I think it's just you sleep in a tent and you get acclimated. But once you're in that tent and you set the altitude you want to be at, you're in there with your snacks, a pee bottle, because you can't leave it at night. If you open it, it kind of all the acclimation opportunity goes away. You have to kind of recalibrate it back again. So you're basically, and if you have a partner, or a spouse or a girlfriend or boyfriend, they have to either not sleep with you for 2 or 3 months, or they have to join you at high altitude and essentially suffer in this lack of oxygen environment in your home. And it does have really other impacts as well. You are just at altitude, not going to recover. So you have to do the training, and then you basically sleep in an environment with less oxygen, which means you don't recover as fast. So there's so many things that it's not just as simple as I get to sleep in a tent and then go up. What you have to push through on a regular basis, the lack of good sleep, the ability to kind of recover with your training, the social aspects of it. You have to be in there for so many hours in order to make that happen. It's a phenomenal achievement. So, and I think anybody that's willing to give that much to do that, deserves to have the sacrifices made.
And the recognition, unbelievable. I want to talk about the positive side. So obviously you've been focusing on the grit and the discomfort and the side of exploration. But obviously the reason why you're doing it is the opportunity to explore nature and its beauty. And I just wondered what parts of your travel stand out to you as a unexpected moment of beauty or a particular moment of tranquility. I expect you've got a few examples.
Yeah, I mean, so again, part of this project, the Peak to Paddle project and the Second Dome project, is about kind of going and exploring the second highest mountains, which are less climbed. And then the Peak Paddle project, which was born from earlier this year in Chile, was about paddling on the highest lakes and the highest bodies of water, or just high altitude bodies of water wherever I was going. And part of that as well was I was on Mount Kenya last October, and I had climbed Kilimanjaro several years ago and had no idea what I was walking into with Mount Kenya. It was just I'm going to sign up for a second highest mountain. I cried multiple times just on the trek in because of the beauty there. And I think Lake Michelson in particular is this place it's this beautiful lake. I paddled on it when we were there this last time and did a bunch of research there, because it's actually, I think, one of the more dynamic opportunities to learn about kind of the high altitude waters of Mount Kenya. It's just this feels like a Jurassic world you're walking into, and there is just these high cliffs and waterfalls and hawks and these hyraxes like on the rocks, and you can fish out of the lake. And it was just, I mean, I would go back there all the time. It was just so beautiful. Antarctica is very similar, like for me as well. It feels so otherworldly. I've always been enamored and dreamed of going to space one day. And it's this idea of kind of like drastic new perspective of the world around you. In Antarctica, where it is essentially void of life once you're on the continent itself, there's just like this pure beauty there. And it's so special. But I mean, I'm known as a crier anyways on summits. And so I usually cry on all mountaintops that I get to, just because I feel it's so special to have reached those places and to be able to like have those opportunities to see parts of the world that few get to. But yeah, I think for me, like Mount Kenya is the one that most recently has just kind of resonated, but I'm really excited about going back because I do think that the first time I went through the 7 summits, a lot of it early on was about just getting it done. And this new project has really slowed me down. And I watch people wake up early and race to the summits, and I wake up a little bit after them and go a little bit less higher up. But I have this very unique, and there's just something for me being on the water that has always been very peaceful. And it's something that is uniquely connected to my childhood. And I think anytime we have a chance to reconnect with things that we loved as a child and loved before we were told to love them, it puts us in a really special place. And for me, being on the water is that way. So whether it's kayaking or paddleboarding or just being down by these altitude lakes and sitting with them, it's really changed my pace and my place of where I put importance as I kind of go forward. I think it's the evolution for me as well, just in my life of my outdoor experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know all the listeners to this will violently agree with you on that one. We had the late Wallace J. Nichols on the show talking about Blue Mind and so on. And I think for paddleboarding, it wasn't a coincidence that coming out of the period of change and upset and stress of COVID, it sort of took off so massively after that. There is something special about being on the water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think it's been something. Yeah, like the ice is amazing and the snow is amazing, but it feels almost adversarial. Like I ice climb as well, and there's something very adversarial about climbing ice. Like it's beautiful and graceful, and I'm not a beautiful and graceful ice climber yet, but like I watch people that do it and it's amazing, but there's still something very much adversarial about like, hitting it with an ice axe and kicking into it. And there's something very much more about the flow and about connection, about dipping your paddle in and pulling and flowing on the water. It's a very different thing. And the chance to do it in places that no one else has done it before is like my own special little selfish thing I get to do. But now being able to marry that with the research I'm doing also lets me hopefully just connect that to something more meaningful. And it, like I've talked about, it just deepens my experience. It's kind of like the outdoors is an orchestra, and you're trying to like hear the different sections play their own notes. And always chasing the summits, you're only kind of going after one part of that kind of like greater acoustic sounds. And like, I want to hear it all. And so by experiencing it differently, I think I get to hear more and I get to experience more.
Absolutely. You get more value than just charging off in various directions. And being in water and mountains and isolated areas, it does tend to make you more focused on preserving it. And obviously you're doing the research that you're doing. And I just wonder whether you had any views, because there is a couple of opposing elements around adventure tourism, particularly. And I just wondered what your thoughts were about squaring the contribution to a particular area by climbers and climbing industry versus the effects of the additional footfall and the effects on the indigenous cultures and the ways of life there.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're probably, I mean, you love Everest, so you've probably dove into some of the complications and the tensions between people saying that we need to stop climbing the mountain. But you can look at the pandemic when people stopped climbing in 2020 and see what happened. And people lost so much because there is this interdependency between tourism and trekkers and people that explore these places and the industries and investments that people local and connected there have built and rely upon. And so I think we don't live in a world of all or nothings. And I think that there is, it's almost like a mountain. We're looking for a new route and we're looking for a new way to kind of go forward. And I think you're seeing people start to do that with kind of trying to remove trash. But I think it's not about necessarily the removal. It's about the evolution of how we initially engage, like through the companies that we select, through where we stay, through the products we buy, through like looking for refurbished items to take with us or secondhand gear and kit, looking for paddle boards that maybe use more sustainable materials. I think it's looking at like what those companies and the brands that we buy from do and how they interact with things. And then when we're there as well, like, is there ways that we can be vehicles for something better, like versus just going and taking from a place? Is there a way that we can do like something like I'm doing right now with this project, is like trying to find stakeholders and researchers and doing something that maybe helps with a greater understanding of these places. And I think there is, again, no way that we can go there and not be impactful in some way, but what impacts do we want to make, and can we make positive ones to kind of offset the environmental ones? And I think, again, this is also maybe not necessarily always pursuing, and this is something that is a bit hypocritical in a way because I've done the 7 summits, but looking at it also like other ways to experience the outdoors. And sometimes we have to, complete something to realize a new perspective. And that's kind of what's happened to me. Is just like, I love like lists and I love going after like, big peaks as well. But I think in the world we live in, there's opportunities to have really meaningful and impactful adventures that are maybe not the ones that are, most celebrated and kind of like get the greatest accolades when it comes to like public perception.
Absolutely. And it's more about participating in the local environment and spending more time rather than just following that sort of A-type personality, just driving to the goal and then looking for the next one, because those sort of people very rarely find what they're looking for in that experience. I just wanted to just talk to you about something else which I know very much interests you. This season that we're sort of producing at the moment is all about adventure, but it's also about accessibility. And I know that you span both areas as well as an advocate and supporter of groups who might not have the opportunity or the history of enjoying nature and these sort of adventurous experiences. So I just wanted to ask your thoughts about that, because paddleboarding, I guess, is fairly similar to climbing in that it's not really representative of the population at large.
Yeah, no, and I think there is a number of things that, growing up, I was on a farm, but I grew up with a single mom. And she was busy running our business. And so, I really didn't have anyone taking me out to the mountains when I was a kid. And I see now this like generation around me of fathers just about taking their kids out there and do that. But I know that there are so many people that either don't have the familial structure or socioeconomically don't, or live in a city and don't have transportation opportunities, or the gear is prohibitively expensive. And so you see all these different barriers, and this goes back to almost law school and social justice. My view is like, we have to create empathy, and the only way we create empathy is through having a relationship. And when it comes to environmentalism and kind of wanting to be altering our behaviors and how we live in it, if we have no relationship with the outdoors, then we're not going to have that deep desire to kind of change our behaviors. And so I think finding ways to give people a unique and meaningful experience, it doesn't mean climbing Everest. It can mean simply getting them to be going down to like a paddling center and giving them opportunities to do that, or finding a local little crag or a little like climbing gym where they can build a community of people that maybe can help them out there, or working on transportation issues to give people access to go climb a trail somewhere outside the city or do a nature walk. I think there are so many ways and there's so many different offerings the outdoors have, but each of them is an invitation to create advocates for them and for like the planet as a whole, which creates a community that allows people to kind of pursue those things more. And I'm working with my local university here that I graduated from, because they have a program called UW Wild, which is very much kind of doing this, creating like another group here, all volunteer based, but it's really trying to find different ways to welcome people in without the financial barriers and trying to create opportunities for them to. I think it's so important to have a community to help people also grow into these different passions, whether they're being on the water or being in the mountains or just kind of like just doing a walk through the park. Like, I think those things are nice to have. Maybe they want to be a birder, which I don't blame them. I love it. So like, I mean, I think any way you want to experience the outdoors is important, but it is about finding ways to make it more accessible and then create a long-term community structure that helps them remain involved, because one-off is great, but I think it's about trying to create something that, if they're passionate about it, fosters their ability to continue to do so.
Absolutely. So, we talked about the fact that we've caught you just ahead of going off to Nepal. Could you just tell us a little bit about what's ahead of you in the next few weeks and months? Yeah.
So I'm off in about 3.5 weeks, 4 weeks. We're heading to Nepal. I'm actually helping guide a feature film that will probably be on a streaming service, but I'm pairing on top of that the opportunity to actually hopefully do some research on some of the higher altitude Himalayan lakes that we're going to be kind of near. So I'll be bringing a very, some form of a paddleboard setup to get out there, and probably a kayak setup as well, and bring all my kit as well for doing kind of sonar GPS measurements so I can bathymetrically map them and hopefully take some water samples. And I think that I'm excited to go back there because, again, it's a place that I've been to several times, but it'll be my first time paddling there. And so hopefully we'll be up kind of outside the Khumbu Valley on some of the glacial lakes, the classic lakes, but some of the other ones as well that are up there that have a more kind of diverse ecosystem, maybe like Gokyu or something like that. So it'll be great. I'll have about 2.5 weeks to trek and to hopefully get some paddling in as well.
Well, it's a stunning location to paddle. Thanks so much for your time, Andrew. You've been very generous. It's been fascinating to dig into the world of a professional adventurer and to get some insights from a different adventure perspective. If people wanted to keep up with your latest, where can we find out about you?
Yeah, my Instagram is Andrew_I Hughes. But that's where I post a lot of the latest content from these things. And if anybody's ever interested or has questions about how they can get out there for the first time as well, I answer every message I ever get, and I'm always available to talk through gear or training or anything at all, or I'll even help people research local groups so they can find their own communities to get out there. I'm here as a resource as much as I am trying to set records. Thanks
very much for all you do, and thanks for such a fascinating chat, and go well in Nepal, and see you on the water.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
From one member of the SUP tribe to another, thank you so much for making it to the end of this episode. Can I also gently encourage you to subscribe to us on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube, and then our episodes will magically drift downstream onto your device. And don't forget, we have over 120 episodes of inspiring people and stories for you to catch up on and to help you expand your own SUP experiences. So take care, and I'll see you on the water.